Hey everybody, welcome to this webinar. My name is Jonathan Greachin. I'm a co-founder at the Founder Institute. And today or tonight, depending on where you are, we're going to be talking about how to get media during these really interesting times in the world. And obviously it's a pretty unprecedented time we were living in, and I would have told you that a week ago, and now these events over the last week have made things a lot more challenging and a lot more interesting, so to speak. So I just want to acknowledge that, we do understand all of the hardships that are going on in the world right now. But today or tonight, wherever you are, we are going to focus on some other things. I doubt you came here to see more about the terrible things that are going on in the world. So we're going to focus on the topic at hand. And that topic is how to get press and how to get media, not only in a time like this where the news cycles are obviously focused on some very specific things, but also into the future. And I'm just looking here, we already got a bunch of people online, which is great. And I'm seeing, let us know where you're from. So I'm seeing here from Toronto, LA, Kazakhstan, that's great. Portland, Oregon, and please let us know where you're from, and also know that we do have a member of the team in the chat. So all throughout this event, at any time, if you have any questions or comments, please throw them into the chat. And after we go through some of the contents of the event, after we go through a presentation, we're just gonna answer all the questions that you have. So again, as I was saying, we're gonna be talking today about media and how to get press during these times. And we got a pretty amazing speaker today, and his name is Conrad. Hey, Conrad.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah, great to have you. So let me just, I'll let Conrad introduce himself in a second as well, but just to give a little bit of background, Conrad runs a company called Publicize. It's publicize.co. This is a company that pretty much specializes in helping small and medium-sized businesses and startups get PR. Because if anybody out there has tried to get PR for their small business or their startup, they know that that's usually something that you're priced out of. And Publicize is a great company. A lot of FI alumni use it, and we use it ourselves at FI. So if that's not a endorsement, I don't know what is. But yeah, Conrad's the guy to talk to if you want to get media. He also runs an incubator called Despacio down in Colombia. And yeah, Conrad, any other things that you want to say about yourself or Publicize?
No, thanks. I mean, I really appreciate the introduction. I'm a huge fan of Jonathan Adale and Founder Institute and the entire program as well. And yeah, I guess my hope, just kind of leading in with this presentation, is to basically take everything I've kind of learned about PR and media and to give that knowledge to everyone kind of watching right now. So if it's okay, yeah, I'd love to kind of hop in on to give a presentation and of course answer any questions anyone has.
Yeah, no, that would be awesome. So before I let Conrad take over the screen here and get on the presentation, just a couple other things. Please, at any time, okay, Conrad's going to go through a presentation. I think he aimed for something like 25 minutes. Don't hold it against him if he goes a little longer. But after that, we want to answer your questions. Okay, that really is the benefit of these events. Otherwise, you can just go to YouTube or something, right? Like, we're here to answer your questions into the chat. So please, at any time, don't be shy. We have somebody in the chat who's interacting in there right now. They're going to collect all the questions that you have, whether you ask it right now or you ask it in 10 minutes, whenever. And then after Conrad's done with this presentation, we're just going to go through them one by one. All right. Well, with that, Conrad, if you want to take it away.
This sounds perfect.
Cool. All right. I'm going to hide my video and my audio and let you take over.
Thanks so much, everyone, for having me. I think this presentation is called How to Get Press for Your Startup During and Post COVID-19. I think one of my aims with this presentation was to kind of outline these core principles for media and kind of at the high level, but also go into the details as well. So actually in this presentation, I have kind of exact emails that we've used in the past that have been really effective and kind of responses from journalists. I'm happy to share this presentation after with everyone as well. I think maybe to start off, I think as many people have seen, COVID-19 has changed industries across the world, and media, of course, isn't an exception. I think three highlights just to start. I think when you are pitching to journalists, COVID-19 is the elephant in the room. In a lot of cases, of course, when you watch the news, it's almost taken all the oxygen out there. I think the second is the way we as founders actually engage with the media has really changed. So in many ways, we're as close to our neighbors as we are to journalists across the globe from us. And the third is that news organizations are being forced to adapt right now. So you see, I think this week, The Atlantic laid off about 20% of their staff. And this does have implications to us as founders and how we approach the media. My aim with this presentation is actually to first outline essentially the basics of PR, the principles of PR that you can follow. And followed by that is really to go into press in the time of COVID-19 and specific strategies that you and your companies can use. And I actually just want to give some background about myself. I was a writer at a tech publication called VentureBeat. I've contributed to written for TechCrunch. I'm a longtime kind of mentor of Founder Institute, a big fan of Jonathan Adeo and their entire team. I'm the CEO of a company called Publicize. Yeah, helped a lot of startups, larger companies like Microsoft, others as well. But I actually want to bring you way back to when I first got started. I was introduced to the tech scene because while I was in university, I'd raised funding for my first startup in Silicon Valley. And I remember I used to see all of my friends who'd raised funding and they'd get on the Wall Street Journal or they'd got on TechCrunch. And that's when you knew that you made it, right? When you're on one of these publications. And I would send out emails to different journalists and I wouldn't get any responses. I remember you thinking like, man, did I screw something up? And just to tell you how bad that I was, I remember running into this person. He was the editor, Eric Schoenfeld of TechCrunch at the time. I ran into him in an elevator and I was so nervous around him. I told him that he was a tech celebrity and I ran out of the elevator and he gave me this really weird look. And so I basically hit rock bottom at that point. And one of the things that I set out to do was I began writing for VentureBeat. And one of the things I looked to do was essentially figure out, hey, is there a process there that a founder, even if they don't have prior success to stand on, can use to get media coverage? How do we kind of reverse engineer that process for founders just like yourself and entrepreneurs could use, again, whether it's for the TechCrunches or the New York Times or these other industries? And I want to start off the presentation by explaining that because I break it down into a 6-step process. It actually has an acronym, which is FAMOUS, okay? I want to lead off by that. And I was thinking actually, hey, how can I best express kind of this 6-step process? And the example I want to use is actually a co-working space I founded in Latin America. And I use a co-working space because when you think about it, co-working it's probably about as boring of a business as it gets, right? Like you're renting office space. And there are new co-working spaces literally every single month around the world, right? We shouldn't have gotten on the Financial Times, on BBC, on TechCrunch, these others, but we did. So I want to explain the strategies that we use that each of you can use for your own companies as well. All right, let's get started. The first step, the F in FAMOUS, the acronym, is Formulate. It's important when each of you as founders go out to the media that you have an announcement to make. So when I was writing for VentureBeat, I remember in New York, a number of friends would come to me. They would say, hey, Conrad, can you write about my company? And I would say, sure, what do you have to announce? They would say, well, we don't have anything to announce. And I would say, well, if you don't have anything to announce, then I can't write anything because there's no story there. So a lot of founders would say, hey, what announcements do startups make? And almost all startups in general, as kind of their cycle as they're growing, may make the following announcement. Their company launches, as an example. Maybe they have a new product launch. They launch an app on Android, on iPhone, a version 2.0 of their platform. Maybe they raise an angel round of funding, a larger venture capital round of funding. They'll hit a milestone, et cetera. These are all announcements that are great. And when they happen, you should communicate to the media. So it may seem kind of, it's hard to differentiate, but as opposed to reaching out to the media and saying, hey, will you write about my company? What you should say is, my company is making this announcement. We're launching a new product. Would you like to cover that specific announcement? And one of the things you'll see is, and actually most people don't realize this, is actually the articles that you read every single day, the announcements in many cases are in the title. So just as an example, this TechCrunch, this article, when we had launched Espacio, we uh, you can see in the title that it says Espacio launches. If we, for example, had raised 500,000 in angel funding, it would say co-working space, the title, Espacio raises 500,000 in funding, etc. So the first step is formulate. The second is amplify. It's important when you go out to the media that you look to kind of explain the big mission of your company. How is your venture going to change the world? If applicable, how will it become a $100 million company? And something I like to tell founders is, do you know when you're about to, you're in the gym or you're about to go to bed and you're daydreaming about your company? You're like, wow, in 3 or 4 years, we're going to be taking over the world, right? Like that great feeling. So whatever vision it is that you see there, that's what you should communicate to the media, because that's a really interesting story. And an example with the co-working space, when we contacted the tech crunches, et cetera, we didn't say, hey, our goal is to rent out offices for $75 a month or whatever it was. What we said was, hey, our big mission is to help turn this city of Medellin into the Silicon Valley of Latin America. And that was a really interesting story that they wanted to cover. So amplify is the second step. The third is messaging. I think this is actually one of our favorite quotes from Jonathan about company messaging that we actually share across our team at Publicize. With messaging, it's important when you communicate to the media that you have essentially two primary documents. You're going to want to have a press release, which follows a very specific format. We actually have a bunch of examples if you want to see. With these, it's really important to use as much data as possible. So as an example, a lot of founders will say, hey, this is a really big market. I don't really even know what big means, as opposed to 100 million, et cetera. Something to keep in mind with press releases is that a lot of people think that the role of the press release is to sell a journalist on why they should cover the story, but that's actually not its purpose. The purpose of the email pitch is to explain why it's a really interesting story. The purpose of a press release is basically, once a journalist decides that they're interested, to basically make it as easy as possible for them to write an article. And the reason for that is many journalists around the US and other countries, they live in really expensive cities, whether it's New York, whether it's San Francisco, et cetera. And in many cases, they're paid a relatively small amount per article. So they have to author a lot of articles. And it's important basically to make it as easy as possible for them to do so, kind of reduce that friction. When you're authoring an email pitch, it's important to lead with social proof. I actually call it type 1 versus type 2. Type 1 is hey, if you're an alumni founder institute, it infers, hey, you're really ambitious, et cetera. Maybe you're a Harvard Business School graduate, et cetera. These kind of things people can infer. Type 2 is actually the other end of the spectrum. Let's say you have an interesting story. You used to be a sports star, or you used to be homeless, or maybe you're a very young, a young founder. I remember I got this email a little while back from this founder, and they said, TechCrunch would never write about me. I'm this 13-year-old founder from Australia. And I said, no, you don't understand. That's why they will write about you. There are not many 13-year-old founders that are emailing TechCrunch. You really stand out with that. I recommend including links to social profiles as well, LinkedIn, et cetera. Unfortunately, there are a lot of fake stories that are sent out. And by including social proof, you're basically saying, hey, I'm putting my name behind this story. It is really important to address a journalist by name in the subject line. And editors do keep in mind, read emails. Just as a data point, I remember back in the day at VentureBeat, about half the stories were sent to tips@venturebeat.com. So those emails are read. The OU and S in the famous acronym, outreach, unrelenting, and strategy. I think for outreach, you basically have two options when you're going to be sending out this press release and email pitch. An exclusive, which basically gives first right to a journalist to cover a story. And the second is an embargo. And the embargo basically says, hey, we're going to email, let's say, 10 different publications. We ask that you not publish an article before, let's say, 1 p.m. on Wednesday, as an example. And the reality is every single day you experience embargoes, because sometimes you might notice like a big company like Apple might make an announcement, and suddenly at 2 o'clock, every single company right after the announcement, they publish an article. And you might think like, how is it possible that they all publish it kind of at the same time and in such a short period after the announcement? And it's because they were given that information ahead of time, but they agreed to the embargo not to publish it until that specific time. And a lot of founders say, hey, exclusive or embargo, it's really risk reward. Exclusive, you can kind of guarantee a certain amount of coverage, which is why I often recommend that, especially to earlier stage founders. something to keep in mind as you're doing kind of being unrelenting with outreach is to also coordinate media with other social platforms. I think Product Hunt's a great option. I think Hacker News, these others are great options as well. There's kind of pros and cons to using a newswire. I'm happy to go more into that in the QA. And the strategy is really, you can actually, as a founder, look ahead the next 3, 4, 5 months and say, hey, we do have these great announcements that we can make into the media. I think one of the mistakes I see a lot of companies make is, maybe in 2017, they make an announcement and, they wait 2 years later for their next one. When they're actually, you as founders building these companies constantly have, great things that you could present to the media. This is actually, this is one of the most important slides that I wanted to share, which is, I remember when, one of the things I used to hear so much about the media was, hey, if I want to be on the New York Times, if I want to be in TechCrunch, et cetera, I have to be best friends with the editor. I'm sure many in the audience, you hear that over and over again. And, when I was a part of the media, I realized, yeah, but that, actually, the relationships can help, but so much of it is following the right process, that the famous acronym, those 6 steps that I just explained. And I remember as I was leaving VentureBeat, I said, hey, I really want to see if this, that process actually works, right? Or is it just about being, best friends with, the editor at XYZ publication? And so actually the very first company I helped was called Safely Filed. I got this call, this older founder from Chicago. He said, hey, I have no background in technology and media in Silicon Valley, New York, et cetera. Can you help with my company? And I said, sure, I'm going to help. But there's actually one thing that I ask, which is that I don't want anyone to know that I'm involved. And I actually want you to set up an alias email. So he set up his email, Mark Snow at Safely Filed, that I would email from. So you can imagine if I'm emailing VentureBeat, I'm not saying, hi, this is Conrad. I'm saying, hi, this is Mark Snow. And I followed literally the exact 6-step process I just shared with each of you. Kind of formulate the announcement, amplify it, look to include a press release, et cetera, and sent it out. And I remember the next day I woke up and I went to my email and I'm super nervous because I'm wondering like, hey, is everything I just told you, that 6-step process, is it actually going to work? Or is media just about these relationships, right? Is this going to work? So I check my email and I don't have any responses. And I'm like very nervous at this point. I'm like, oh, hey, what I just explained, does it actually work, right? I'm like, oh, well, you know what, I need to give myself 24 more hours. So, the day goes on, I go to sleep, I wake up the next morning and I'm super nervous about to open up my email to see like, hey, will this process actually work that I just followed? So I open up my computer, I check my email and I don't have any responses. And at this point, I'm just like depressed. I'm like, oh, this is just terrible. I guess it just didn't work, et cetera. And literally right at that moment, I get this phone call. It's Mark Snow. And he calls me. He says, Conrad, you've done this fantastic job. We've gotten all these media results. And I'm so confused. I don't know what's going on. I'm like, oh, I just realized I've been emailing as Mark Snow on this other email, but I'm checking my personal email account. So I go check the other email. We've gotten all these responses back, right? We've got them on VentureBeat. These are the founders. Got them on the Next Web. We had gotten them on Pando Daily, a bunch of these others. And all, everyone that I, was speaking to, they all said, oh, Conrad, of course you got it from VentureBeat, like, those people really well, et cetera. And I said, no, you don't understand. No one knew that I was involved. We followed the right process. And we actually had tested this out over dozens and dozens of data points. And we found, hey, if we follow the right process, we can get great results, et cetera. And it's great to cultivate relationships, and you should absolutely do that. But also for the founder, again, who doesn't yet have prior success to stand on, you can get great results for yourself. Okay, I want to hop into the next section, which is thought leadership. I think this is such a key area that it's one of the most kind of overlooked areas for a lot of founders that I found, which is, if you ever see, again, whether it's Wired magazine, whether it's Inc. magazine, VentureBeat, et cetera, oftentimes it is contributed articles. And in a lot of cases, we will help with ghostwriting, et cetera. But this is a key area that a lot of founders can do themselves. And it's great to essentially position you and your team as basically thought leaders in a very specific space. And it's really important because one of the key areas, of course, for PR, any marketing channel is you have to drive new leads for yourself. You have to drive new revenue and hit these key metrics, whether it's traffic, et cetera. But I think in the long run, one of the key wins for PR is you basically want to own share of space own share of mind for a really specific space. You know, the reality is I think when to me, anywhere around the world, when people think about, about accelerators, about fostering entrepreneurship, they think of Founder Institute, they think of Jonathan, they think of Adeo. And that's because all this effort that they've done has kind of compounded over time. And each of you, whether you founded an accounting startup, you want to be kind of known as the thought leader for that specific space. It could be for any industry, it could be for any product, et cetera. This is actually the exact email that I sent the very first time that I sent an article to TechCrunch to be published there. And I think I'm happy to go more into this in the Q&A. To me, two things to highlight is when you first send out the email, actually author the first article. That'll basically get your foot in the door. Because in many cases, people will read the article and say like, hey, like, I might not know this person, but it looks like a really good article. It's not too self-promotional. You know, I'm happy to, again, answer this more later on. A couple of things to mention are the article ideally shouldn't be too self-promotional, and it should look to kind of follow the guidelines of the specific publication, that format. In general, most articles tend to be between 1,000 to 1,500 words, and they usually follow a 5-paragraph format. Just something to mention. Okay, I want to go into PR and press outreach during COVID-19, and kind of another acronym, 6 principles I want to focus on. Just follow kind of the word change. And the first is COVID, and it's really this elephant in the room. And I know a lot of people are saying, hey, maybe there's COVID fatigue in the media, et cetera. But the reality is my recommendation is to align at least 70% of any media outreach you do relate those to COVID related angles. And just as an example, if you're looking to pitch a thought leadership article on marketing insight, I'd recommend revising the angles slightly, for example, for marketing in the time of COVID-19. If let's say you have a startup in the med tech space and the health tech, and you're looking to make a huge impact in this space, I would also look to align and say, hey, it's not just going to alleviate this, but obviously the pandemic is impacting individuals in this large way, can also impact it there. I think that's increasingly important. So I can't think of a publication right now that, especially within the technology sector, that isn't kind of introducing series specifically directed towards COVID. It is on top of mind for a number of editors. And it's just as a rule of thumb, if you're thinking, hey, should I include a COVID angle or not? I would look to include a piece of it in there. The second, the H in change, is have your finger on the pulse. I think it's more important now than ever before to monitor the media and to understand what the conversation is. I think the reality is, if you're looking to be a part of the conversation, what matters first is kind of identifying what people are talking about. If you're looking for if I had one recommendation about a great place to start, I think LinkedIn. If you ever looked at their top right, the today's news and views, I think they've done a great job. It's kind of one place to start there, kind of highlighting a list of topics that are in the news that day. I think the second note is to really be aware of the channels that journalists are using. So just an example, a number of journalists from TechCrunch use Signal and Telegram for pitches. We've actually seen this highest response rate from Twitter. In many ways with COVID-19, it's almost like the platform that the specific journalist prefers, they've doubled down on that specific platform. I think the last thing is media, and this aligns into the next slide, media stories are moving faster than ever before. And going along this line, kind of the A approach with care, because these stories are moving faster than ever before, it's so important to be aware of that. So just as an example of this week, with stories about the protests, et cetera, we've had to have conversations with a number of companies basically saying, hey, that earlier message that we're announcing, we're going to pause on that, because the reality is this week, the stories are focused on the protests. And that's what's kind of taking the oxygen in a lot of ways in the room. It is important to differentiate as a founder between media campaigns that are time sensitive versus non-time sensitive. So let's say your company's making this press release announcement about something that needs to come online this week. Like obviously there's certain things you can't push back, But for example, if you're looking to set up an interview about your thoughts about the future of a specific space or industry, that's something that you might be able to send off, to wait 2 weeks to send, et cetera. Second thing is, it's so key to send today, especially where there's so much noise, polite follow-ups with journalists. Just as a general rule, we find we get more responses from the first follow-up to a journalist than we do on the initial pitch itself. So I'm happy in the future to send examples of follow-up to people listening, but it could just say something like, "Hi, name, hope all's well. I just wanted to send a quick follow-up. If there's anything I could further send, I'm really happy to." Just something like that. I think the last thing is, look to be extra thoughtful in communications. You never know when a journalist being contacted might have a family member impacted due to COVID. And this is actually just one example of an email. A journalist messaging someone in our family was sick, sent a polite follow-up. The nice article was published a few days later. I just think it's so important to be sensitive to in communications right now. Fourth, now is the time for solutions. I think there's so many challenges going on. I think something to keep in mind is that journalists do want to hear about good news and also propose solutions. I think the reality is COVID-19, it came as a surprise to so many people. And in particular the establishment, right? Like the kind of thought leaders we normally turn to for solutions, in many cases, don't necessarily have these. So the media now, more than ever personally seen, they're looking beyond this for almost these new founders and new group of individuals for ideas, for predictions, et cetera. So whether it's a pitch about to better provide insight in a specific area, or a future prediction that you have, we found journalists are really receptive to these pitches. I do believe this is a great opportunity to basically position yourself and your team in this new paradigm that we're in. And just as an example, so this is an example of a result we gotten from Business Insider. So I actually redacted the individual's name, but the idea was basically, hey, there's this really promising founder of this health tech company. She'd love to give comments on these kind of, whether it's dietary or lifestyle advice for any of your readers. Business Insider responded saying, hey, we're looking for some insight on this specific question, et cetera. And we were able to respond that. But you can imagine, again, whether it's Business Insider, whether it's, VentureBeat or more mainstream publications, they are looking for expert commentary on, and new ideas for a lot of these different spaces. The fifth, the G in change, is global mindset. I mentioned before, we're as close to our neighbors now in many ways as we are to individuals in other countries. And what it means, and I don't think most people recognize this yet, is that your company itself actually has access to a much larger market than you may realize, and also access to more journalists than ever before. So I would actually argue the number of journalists that you have access to might have doubled or tripled in size. And in part, that's because these issues that were once only local are now really global. And I think about the people we've introduced to editors and journalists in Asia, in Australia, and Africa, et cetera. I would argue it's tripled from even a handful of months ago. And just something to kind of keep in mind, and I think particularly because, to me, I actually look at, I think most people don't think about this. I look at PR as a secret weapon for SEO. So again, irregardless of your space, actually search is still going to drive a lot of traffic. So I do think it's worth considering, hey, actually, am I introducing software, let's say in the US? Well, hey, is that potentially relevant as well now, even in a shorter period of time, to a journalist in Australia or Europe, et cetera. The last step in the change acronym is the E, the editorial opportunity. I would argue there's more opportunity for thought leadership than I've ever seen, in my time in this industry. I think as many of you've seen, companies such as Condé Nast, such as Vice, such as BuzzFeed, et cetera, have made a number of different layoffs to members of the media. And this comes after, keep in mind, roughly half of all US newspapers' jobs were removed. And I just want to kind of explain the implications for this. When these news organizations, they still need to produce a high number of editorial of content every single day, every single week, but there are obviously a number of fewer people. So what most people don't realize is they actually really like when there are people sending great pieces of articles to be used for their publications. And as entrepreneurs, this is a huge win because, especially from the largest media, you will see a return on investment, from my personal experience, on doing that. So again, I just found it to be super effective. I think, as a note, media, they're not just interested in kind of these superhero images, but also, hey, what were the challenges that you faced and overcame, and what you learned from that? I think those tend to resonate really well in the media, and I'm happy to answer that more in the QA. I just want to say again, thank you. I've been a fan, supporter, a mentor, Founders Institute for many years now, and can't speak highly enough about the organization. If there's anything I could follow up on, my email is Conrad@publicize.co, and one of the things I actually really like that Jonathan mentioned was, hey, these are such hard times right now, but like, if there's any, the people who are best suited to actually face this adversity head on and actually overcome it are entrepreneurs, are founders. And so again, we're facing so much adversity, and I wish the best to everyone here. At the same time, I do believe, the people who, there's so many opportunities ahead for all those as well. So thank you so much again for having me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Conrad. All right. So why don't we get started on some of these questions? We got a lot of them, and please, anybody else, if you have questions, throw them into the chat. I'm also just really quickly going to point out a couple of things. So, you mentioned that news organizations are struggling, right? And this is something too that that has a lot of implications, right? So one of the implications you said was obviously like they news organizations, they will welcome good content, right? So if you want to provide some value to them and actually create content for them that's not overly promotional about your business, your company, or whatever, they will, generally speaking, they might be interested. What are some other implications there? I know, like first of all, a lot of times when I tell founders, when they interact with journalists, I'm like, look, it's almost like an investor. Like, they're super busy, like short messages to the point, don't waste their time. I mean, any other implications just in sort of the way that the media industry is sort of hurting right now that entrepreneurs should understand in all of their interactions?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really good question. I guess, to me, when I think about PR, it's interesting. I remember, let's say, go back like 20 years. I think to me, PR was all about contacting journalists, right? And like, the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera. And then let's say 15 years ago, that kind of actually evolved. It became about contacting journalists and bloggers. And one of my beliefs from a handful of years ago was basically that, like, PR, especially for a lot of founders, it's not just about contacting journalists anymore or bloggers, but actually increasingly gatekeepers. So to me, I actually look at a lot of the press outreach. It will be just as much about contacting, somebody from TechCrunch as it is, let's say, a moderator at Product Hunt, or actually, let's say, an executive producer at, the Joe Rogan podcast or one of these popular podcasts. So to me, my hope, you made a really good point about, like, hey, these all the communication should be kind of to the point and be really clear, and because people just don't have a lot of time and are busy. But I think on the bright side, a lot of the principles apply, and I would kind of recommend to people just to continue to look at PR increasingly as, again, a lot of these journalists are kind of gatekeepers to this larger audience, but you can go beyond just traditional media publications as well.
Right. Okay. And then just really quick before I get into some of the questions, and there's a lot of them here, so please, everyone, keep them coming. But, I know you mentioned a little bit about the process. Right. And I think I see a lot of people get this wrong as well. So you were kind of saying, like, okay, so step one is the email pitch, right? And that has a very specific goal. And then step two, after you sort of get somebody hooked, so to speak, on the email pitch, then there's the second step. Like, how would you see sort of that kind of 101 process that anybody should sort of look for?
So to me, with a lot of the, let's say, like, founders who are like, hey, I'm working on this idea, we're still maybe 3 months away. The first thing would be, okay, the first announcement to the media to Formulate is basically the company launch. So then saying, okay, from that company launch, hey, how do we make, usually you talk to founders and say, hey, what are you working on? And they're like, hey, we're building this software for this, this enterprise software. And you say, like, hey, well, no, but tell me, like, what's your kind of big mission and goal that you have? And they're like, hey, well, actually, we're looking to really revolutionize this huge area. Like they amplify and make it really interesting. So that would be the second thing. The third would be like the messaging. Okay, take that announcement about the launch and that kind of big mission and put it in a press release and email pitch. So that would be the third one. The fourth would be the outreach. So whether it's, okay, now that email being sent out, whether that's an exclusive or embargo, choose one of those. And then the fifth one would be, okay, once those articles, let's say, VentureBeat decides to cover the launch of your company, look to further the outreach as well to other publications. And then the last step is basically saying, okay, like we got some coverage on VentureBeat and a handful of smaller blogs. Okay, what do we have the next strategize actually the months ahead? So, okay, well, we also have another announcement we can make in six weeks. And then, maybe 4 weeks after, we're raising a round of funding that we can announce. So that would kind of be the process I would recommend.
Okay. So I'll start here with Ravi's asking. Ravi had a couple questions, but they're sort of centered around the same thing, which is, when do you think is the right time for a startup to do PR? Yeah. And then the first part of the question also was like, should they be looking to do PR before even like launching a product? I know it's pretty general, but what are sort of the general advice you can give on when to start it?
Yeah, I would say in general, once you're ready, let's say advertise on Facebook or Google about your product. At that point, to me, you're ready to kind of launch, to announce it to the media as well. Just in general, I would usually say, hey, if you finish a product, almost have like an alpha that you test among your kind of your close friends, et cetera, to work out any bugs. But then kind of following that, I'm much more the belief. I believe it was Reid Hoffman who says, hey, if you're launching and you're not embarrassed about the product, you're launching too late. And I think about it even right now, like you can Google search just TechCrunch Conrad Publicize, and you'll see when we launched the product of Publicize. And it's actually got this kind of bad photo of me here. Or anyway, we didn't, it was just, we took a very quick photo and I remember in hindsight, looking back, like I'm so embarrassed about that, but we actually needed that to happen, because once we happened, it's almost like we were able to grow and evolve like in, a 6 week period of what would have taken us, 6 months or 12 months. So, and I actually hear that story over and over again. I think one of the mistakes I would try to avoid, which, I do see happen a lot, is, the founder that says, hey, we really want to launch in 2 months. And then 2 months come by and they say, no, we're going to push it back, now 3 months later. And then usually what ends up happening is a year and a half later, they still haven't launched anything.
Yep. Yeah. The forcing function, right? Forcing functions can be super valuable. We tell our founders too, whether it's a pitch event you need to apply to or something, right? You can create these forcing functions. And you were saying, like, literally FI started the same way, by the way. Like, we were just throwing around ideas. Deo, my co-founder, kind of tipped off inadvertently Michael Arrington, who was the kind of sole proprietor at the time of TechCrunch. And he was like, well, I'm writing the story tomorrow. So we registered the domain name, Founder Institute. We had to do all of that stuff very, very quickly. So yeah, we fall into this. I mean, we still would have launched it, but that forced us to like, okay, shit. So Omid and Wes were asking kind of, Omid's question was, is there a good database or resource to find the journalists that you should contact, i.e. a white pages to find journalists? And Wes sort of had a related question, which is, you mentioned Joe Rogan's podcast or Bropra, I think people are calling him these days. Like where would you go to find just the right people to contact there?
For sure. I would say actually probably the best starting resource, if you email me at Conrad at publicize.co, it's one that Publicize created, and I can send it to you of kind of a starting list of, it has a number of technology journalists and their emails, et cetera.
Oh yeah. You guys have a free journalist list that you put out there.
I think like they're larger ones that tend to be kind of more, pretty expensive, it might be $2,000 every month, et cetera, to access by Cision, things like that. I would say, so yeah, again, not to be kind of, it's a free resource we'd created. So I would probably start there.
Yeah. And we'll send out Conrad's contact information. Something that I like to tell people too is, generally speaking, you don't want to like just spam bomb 100 journalists, right?
Sure.
If you think that maybe you want to be on TechCrunch or something like that, you're probably going to want to find the journalists on TechCrunch that are writing about your space, right? And these are all generally like pretty easy Google searches, writing about competitors, related companies. That, like, those are usually the types of people that you want to reach out to, right? Like, you don't generally say like, oh, I want to get on TechCrunch. Like, you don't pitch TechCrunch, you have to pitch a person. Right?
For sure. And that's a really good point. I think to me, talking to founders, usually they fall on like what one of two spectrums. Like spectrum one is like, hey, I'm just going to collect like 3,000 emails and just send out like a BCC and like just to everyone, and like, please don't do that.
That's a quick way to piss a lot of people off.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then like the other end of the spectrum is like, hey, for 3 months, I'm literally just going to like follow this journalist like every single day to like find out as much information as I can. And the reality is that's probably not the most effective use of your time either. So what I would recommend is, hey, have a pitch, have a list of people you want to contact, make sure to send out an individual email at a very bare minimum, say like, hi, name. Just doing that, we've tested, will dramatically improve the open rate, at a kind of a bare minimum. And you can kind of find almost, that's like kind of an 80-20 of getting 80% of the results when a relatively short period of time. Anyway, that kind of thought came to mind.
Yeah. And I see a lot of these emails too, just because we have like a blog and this kind of stuff, and people just see us like, oh, Founder Institute writes about entrepreneurship. It's a media channel. So I get a lot of these, and yeah, it's like a novel attached with the press release, right? Very impersonal, and it doesn't make you feel real good, right? It doesn't, it makes you not, there's no personal touch to it at all, right?
Absolutely.
So a bunch of people here were also asking like, okay, so you reach out, you follow up, like Aaron is asking, and I think I saw Aaron before was saying that their response rate to some of their outreach was somewhere around 5%. So I think we can help you, Aaron, in some way, shape, or form here. But Aaron the question was, how many times is it appropriate to reach out? I don't want to bug them. Is it okay to start over and try again a week later?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, as like a general rule, I wouldn't, just for follow-ups, I'd make sure to always follow up at least once. Again, we've had higher response rates on that than the initial pitch. And again, the people that you're contacting are receiving a lot of messages. I would say I wouldn't send more than 2 follow-ups, just as kind of a general rule. To me, one way you could kind of test it would be mentioning, for example, let's say you decide you have an announcement you want to use an exclusive, and mentioning the subject line. And by doing that, you could kind of get a sense of like, hey, today we want to send the exclusive to this publication. Oh, this journalist at TechCrunch. Okay, if on day 4, no one's responded back, you could almost go back to the pitch and say like, okay, well, maybe I should revise something, et cetera. Maybe the information in the pitch is too vague that I can. So by doing that, you can kind of get a sense of like, okay, now as opposed to maybe sending the pitch out to 50 journalists all at once, and then you can't really kind of iterate on kind of on the specific pitch.
Yeah, for sure. And that brings up another question. I know I saw it in here. I can't find the exact name, but people were mentioning sort of like the timing, right? Because obviously if you want to iterate on something, and let's say that, oh, you need to launch next week, right? Like, that's probably not going to work. So, is there a specific kind of timing that you would want to start doing some outreach before you actually want to, relative to when you would want something to get published?
For sure. I mean, probably as like a rough range, I would say about 2 weeks would be kind of enough advance warning, advance notice, but also give you enough time to contact enough journalists ahead of time. It's just kind of a rough number. I would say, as a general rule, avoid the weekends, of course, for any outreach. I would say avoid Friday as well. And in general, earlier in the week and in the morning is preferable. Obviously, keeping in mind the time zones for, whether you're contacting someone, in Europe is obviously very different than New York or California as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's see. Just to switch gears here a little bit. So Mark was asking, what about like editorial distribution, i.e., paid placement?
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on some of those things?
So the reason in general I'm against this is what actually typically happens. So somebody would approach, let's say, like a Harvard Business Review, and they say, "Hey, I'd love my article that I wrote to be considered." And to be honest, this is what normally happens. If it's a really good article, the editor would be like, "Hey, this looks really good. We'll publish it, 2 weeks from now." And if it's not a good article, you get this response, which is basically the advertorial team, which is like, would you like to pay $10,000, whatever, a really large amount, right? And keep in mind, I think it was BuzzFeed. I think it started at, I mean, these of course have changed, but I think it was 25,000. Like a lot of these cost a lot of money, but also not only does it cost more money, but also it has this big kind of, sponsored, et cetera. So it's less effective as well. So to me, I would say 100% recommend more focusing on high quality results and doing a great job. Because if you do it the right way, you'll save a lot of money and you'll get better results, as opposed to the alternative. Yeah.
Right. That sounds to me too in that scenario that somebody read it and was like, okay, this is not editorial. This is an advertisement.
For sure.
And as such, I'm going to give it to my advertising team.
For sure. Yeah.
Right.
And I think, unfortunately, to me, it's kind of counterintuitive, but also I think aligns with Silicon Valley, which to me is like the articles, the aim isn't to be like, this is why our company is great. The aim is to be like, here's just all this free information that we're giving about, where this industry is heading. And then again, the counterintuitive thing is by doing that, it'll obviously include like your name, your photo, or link back to your website, is more people will come to you and be like, hey, I read your article and I learned a lot. And that's why, I want to, hear even more about your company, et cetera. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Don't look at it as an ad. Look at it as you're providing value. People are going to read an article. If they learn something from the article, they will see where the article came from, and then over time that will drive your results, SEO, and all that good stuff. Okay, so let's see. Keep the questions coming. This is great, everybody. Please, this is awesome. So let's see. Alice is asking a specific press release format that you recommend.
I would say, honestly, this is what I would do in the very beginning, because I remember sometimes when I recommend to friends about a press release, usually what happens is the first document they send to me, it almost sounds like a novel, and which makes sense because that's normally what you write throughout, university, et cetera. But the reality is a press release, when you first read it for the first time, it actually is kind of uncomfortable to read because it's not meant to be read for the general public. It's meant to be read for specific reporters to pull information from. So if I were actually in somebody's shoes, and maybe this is just myself personally, I would look, again, it doesn't have to be the resource I mentioned, the link I have, but you could just Google search any press release and copy paste in a Word document and follow that structure, but obviously as a template. So usually what happens is, let's say it starts off by explaining, the first or second sentence, explaining what the announcement actually is. So you can say like, okay, well this, you can talk about your company. And then, let's say the second or third paragraph includes a quote from the founding team. So you would know like, okay, well here I should add a quote from your own team talking about, the company, et cetera. So look to kind of follow that as a rough idea. And that's something that would be the step that I'd recommend as for press releases.
Yeah, press releases, it's media writing, right? So it's known as, sure. And I'm going back to my college days here, but I believe it's the inverted pyramid.
For sure, right? Yeah.
Just means the most important information at the top, and then basically the further down you go, the less important the information is. It's sort of like, like you said, it's not meant to be read by the general public. And a lot of people write it as an advertisement. The point is to distill all the most important information as quickly as possible so that the journalists can do their job and write a story about what you're trying to tell them.
Right? For sure. No, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Still a lot more questions coming in about like how to find the right people. So Anil is asking, if your strategy is to target local communities, how would you prioritize like which publication, might be the right fit for you to target?
Yeah, I mean, just in the one thought that came to mind is, especially if you're entering a space which is fairly crowded, and let's say there are other incumbents, I would actually just take the name of whichever company that's like, the number one player, et cetera. And just go to Google News and type in that name. And then you could probably see like, hey, if somebody from TechCrunch or, The Verge, et cetera, is going to write about, Slack, and I'm also creating, a communication, then maybe be more likely to cover your company as well. So that's one option. I would say in terms of local in general, to me, increasingly so, they're kind of a handful of kind of the major players, and a lot of news coverage resonates from that. So I'd probably start with, looking at that in a specific technology or, business reporter there.
Makes sense. Rob asking very tactical question here, like when should you in a pitch email, so let me just rephrase this question here. In the pitch email, should you be sending along the press release, or should you just be sending along kind of the text pitch?
I would definitely include the press release in that, whether it's an attachment or whether it's copy paste at the bottom. I mean, actually it's funny. So some people always ask me like, hey, is there a hack to this? And I always tell them, I actually think the 6 steps, the famous acronym, is kind of a hack. But if you want an additional one, let's say you're like, I have no time for this. Okay. What I would say is, okay, well, you should still formulate the announcement, amplify it, and do an email pitch. But in the email pitch, just say like, hey, here's, a few sentences about what the announcement is about. If you'd like more information, I'm happy to send you a press release. So then if you get any responses back from any journalists, like, hey, I want to see the press release, then you could be like, okay, damn, I got to put the press release together really quickly. Right. So anyway, if you're looking for a hack, this being said, that I only would recommend that if you're so swamped for time, you literally can't put a press release and you got to get something out. In general, I'd always recommend including the press release, again, whether it's an attachment or copied in the email.
Okay. Kevin was asking, and this probably relates kind of to the topic before, right? Where we were talking about just how media in general is struggling, and it's all of our fault, everybody, because we don't like to pay for stuff. But, so Kevin, I was told by an article writer that my announcement or press release will be more likely to written about if I plan to push traffic to the article. Thoughts on this? Is this something that you see? I mean, logically it makes sense to me. I think it's kind of weird that they would tell you that and kind of make that almost a prerequisite. But
to be honest, my gut tells me that, like, in terms of like the top tier media, I don't know of any journalist at one of those who would write that. If I had to guess, it's more of hey, maybe there's, kind of a media entrepreneur who recently founded a blog, and hey, they're really looking to drive as much traffic as possible. And the reality is part of that is, hey, whoever they cover, it's as helpful as possibly to be proactive. I do think it's important to look to add value in the media as much as possible. And it is something you kind of have to be sensitive about as well. So, one of the things we do, for example, is, we send on the holidays, some like nice homemade, I actually have my family, like I'll ask my mother to make these homemade things. She always, used to send out, because it can't be, like, hey, here's a gift certificate because we really appreciate your help. It's just, that would kind of be crossing a line there. Yeah. So other ways you could add value to the media would be, hey, just, making sure that if, a popular blogger or journalist writes about you, making sure to tag them, kind of widely share it. I think, that's kind of at the very, very least, I'd say other things would be, hey, if you find out there's a neat, like, conference speaker role, for example, that maybe the journalist could moderate, et cetera, looking for opportunities like that. The reality is it's so, most people, once a journalist writes an article, they don't even get a thank you email from it, So I think any little extra effort you could show just stands out about, like, hey, this is like a really nice person. And, like, those things in the long run, I think, kind of go a long way.
Yeah. If you put yourself in their shoes, they don't exactly have the most glorious profession. They don't get thanked a lot. They probably, they probably don't get a lot of pats on the back when they do a good job, but if they say something wrong in one of their articles, they get condemned. They're expected to pump out a lot of content. The economics of the whole business are bad. Yeah. So, I mean, and one thing about just providing value, right? And this is something that Conrad does with FI a lot. right? It's not necessarily, he's not pitching FI and saying like FI is the greatest. It's just, something's going on in the world, whether maybe it's tensions between the US and China, or maybe it's the onset of COVID or things like that. And you'll just reach out to different media channels and be like, hey, if you're interested in getting at the perspective from entrepreneurs or from VCs and this kind of stuff, like the FI people might be able to help, right? Just throwing it out
For
there.
sure.
Right. And that really is a kind of thing where you're literally trying to help these people do their jobs. Right.
Sure.
And yeah, like it's not like they're going to throw in an advertisement for Founder Institute or any organization that's just trying to provide value. But those are things that I'm sure, that those things pay dividends in the future, because
sure.
you're helping the journalists do their job. And also you're helping yourself too, because you can potentially show up in these articles as a thought leader, link backs, all this kind of stuff, right?
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things, Jonathan, you do this super well. I think Adele as well, is because you're so helpful. Like the reality is, in the media industry, people don't realize, like, the journalist that you speak from the Atlantic, in 2 years from now might be at the Washington Post or the Wall Street, or in 4 years from now will be at the New York Times. So it is, a really interconnected community. So you never know. I mean, again, yeah. I think in a good way. I think if you build a reputation as being somebody really helpful, looking to kind of add value, that it'll kind of spread over the long run.
Yeah, for sure. Treat journalists like humans.
For sure.
I tell people that a lot too. They're in a struggling in a struggling business. So try to help them if you can. A couple other so we only got a couple of minutes left here. Last call for questions. All right. And let's just do sort of some rapid fire here. Okay. So Andrea, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, and Sam, do you think any of the advice that you're giving right now would be different dependent on like geographic location?
I in general, I think it would be slightly, but I would think 90% of it actually crosses over. And actually, one of the things a friend of mine, when I posted on Facebook, had mentioned, hey, would this be kind of applicable to his specific product, even if it's a different industry? One of the things that's great about these principles is we found it been just as effective on TechCrunch as it is for People Magazine, or Hollywood Reporter, et cetera. Completely different industry, or whether it's more mainstream, like, the Washington Post, et cetera. I'd say for certain regions of the world, for example, in Latin America, I think, for example, it's much more acceptable to call one another over phone as opposed to, I think, Jonathan, you've probably seen it in the US, like if somebody calls you and, they're making, it won't go down.
I don't pick up any number I don't know.
So there are certain things, I think, but I would say I would think 90% of it would apply across. And again, there's some smaller changes there.
Okay. Couple people ask questions like PR Newswire or Newswire, and there's a lot of these services.
For sure.
I don't know. I think there's been some consolidation in that space, but what are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, I think so. There's some kind of misunderstanding about it. I think, let's say going back 20 years, 30 years, a lot of journalists would go to the Business Wire, and that's actually where they'd get the stories from, right? And then they'd write about it. The reality is today, like, I don't know of anyone from, the New York Times or TechCrunch, et cetera.
Well, now there's
would ever do that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And and now, I mean, if you want an article to be featured on the front page, which is where viewers are, you're gonna have to email that. You should expect to email that specific journalist. In general, with I think the misconception with using, let's say, a Business Wire is, sometimes you might see a Yahoo Finance, and the reality is that's not like when you go to Yahoo Finance on the homepage. That's 10 pages deep, right? So I do think, though, there are people who say, like, hey, we're part of a larger company that does for search, want to kind of index this announcement that we're making. And I would say in those cases, my recommendation would be, hey, if you're going to use a kind of a news syndication, look to use one that's less expensive. Don't go for the thousands of dollars that, all the extra kind of bells and whistles, because and just be sure, like, hey, we're paying this X amount because we're looking to index this announcement, not because we're expecting it to be on the homepage of any, and to get a lot of views, these things.
Yeah, I'll be a little less diplomatic. Conrad's just a really nice guy. I think it's a complete waste of money. It's a pure SEO play. Like, it's not press. Like, you're not going to get any press from it. It's SEO. right? And for whatever reason, I think Google still gives a lot of those services like a decent amount of SEO, probably just because they have a bunch of syndication partners and stuff, right? But yeah, it's a pure SEO play, and in that respect, I have seen like some SaaS companies, B2B companies, find it useful, right? Because those have like very specific keywords that where SEO is super important. But for consumer, I think it's a total waste of money. And anyway, I think it's more of an SEO thing. So all right, let's see. So Thomas has an interesting question. Like, does fake it till you make it apply to PR?
I mean, I think, yeah, I guess I think, obviously there's certain like extent, there's an extent to that.
It's a little general.
Yeah. The reality is though, even think about like Twitter when they first launched, I think, wasn't it like Twitter's first product iteration only took like 2 weeks to develop, right? Like it really came, quickly. I think it obviously is really industry specific, because like if you're in health tech, like, obviously it's a different standard than, if you're, in another space. I would say I would lean more towards, focus on specific areas of social proof that allow you to kind of stand out. And I would say, if you're ready to advertise your product, you're probably ready for PR. And again, the saying from Reed, which was kind of, if you launch too late, if you're not embarrassed, you're probably launching too late, but probably don't overdo it as well.
Yeah, there's a good balance, because you do like you were saying before, right? A bunch of your points where it's not just what you do, right? It's your vision, what you're trying to do.
For sure.
The bigger things. So in I guess in some respects you could say, yeah, like you're not doing this bigger thing that you want to do, but that is your plan, and you're a startup, so obviously you can't do everything at once. So I don't know if I'd necessarily call that fake it till you make it.
For sure.
But yeah, kind of the bigger vision, I think is pretty important when you're talking to journalists, right?
Oh, absolutely.
All right. So thank you everyone for joining. I'll just one little final closing tip. So by the way, we've mentioned a bunch of resources on this webinar, and we're going to include, number one, the video, everybody's going to get it. We're going to include the links to Conrad's site and Conrad's personal email. I'm surprised. You really want me to send your personal email?
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. He sent it to me in an email before. I'm like, all right, that's fine. So you're going to get Conrad's personal email. But to be honest with you, it's probably not that hard to guess. And by the way, most journalists' emails aren't that hard to guess either. But yeah, there's a ton of free resources available on publicize.co, including, I think you guys have like a press release template thing on there. I know you got this free press list. So we will send that to everybody. But yeah, Conrad, just a lot of the people on the webinar today or tonight are early stage founders, and as you could see from some of the questions, when can I do it? How many emails should I send? All this kind of stuff. Any kind of like final closing tip, or maybe it's the biggest misconception that you see people have, or just the tip that you think has resonated the most, just a closing thought for
I would say, to me, I would just really encourage founders to kind of get started. And I say that especially with the media. I think there's this perception that like, hey, I'm going to reach out to the media and like, I'm going to get all this negative coverage. And something to keep in mind about like just the news cycle is normally like when you're first starting off as a founder, you have to first kind of be built up, right? And if a tech reporter, then in general, they wouldn't write a negative story about you. They're just, they just won't cover your story. And then obviously you reach a certain point where your organization gets big enough, whether it's a Microsoft, et cetera, where then you're starting to see, hey, you have to be a lot more careful about who you pitch, because, there might be just as many negative stories as positive. So, but especially as you're a founder first starting off, it's, I think about it, like the thousands upon thousands of data points we have. I think the only story I know of, only one instance where the reporter wrote something negative, and they actually wrote the founder ahead of time. They said, hey, you're saying like basically this is a location, like there's no tracing, but like there is tracing that you're doing. And actually the founder was still really happy about the story. So keep in mind that's across, maybe however many, 5,000, 10,000 data points. So I would just encourage people to kind of to try reaching out to the media. following these principles, looking to use these templates as well. And yeah. Also, Founder Institute obviously has some fantastic resources as well. And
That's a really great
chapters as well.
That's a really great point. Not about FI, but just about, how, and Aaron was saying here too, as a corollary, if someone is writing something negative about you when you're small, it must be a pretty big story, right? So
for sure.
It's, for sure. The negative stories that you see about Apple or whatever, or some big executive saying the wrong thing, probably not going to apply to you as a startup, right? Sure. That doesn't mean go start, mouthing off, but it's definitely an irrational fear that I've had too, right? Because you sort of look at the worst possible scenario, but that's usually only going to happen when people really care, which is when you're like famous or some big company, right?
For sure. No, absolutely.
All right, awesome. So, hey, everybody, thank you so much for joining. Please, as I said, we're going to be sending you all of this information. Check out Conrad's company, Publicize.co. And we got a lot more free online startup events coming up as well. You can find those at fi.co/events or onlinestartupevents.com. All right, thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope